You're welcome to Ireland. It's absolutely amazing to see so many people here. It's quite an extraordinary achievement, and I not only want to thank Andrina and Nan and Susan, but just want to recognise the work that they have put into getting this group of people together. Thank the consortium and the organisation team and so on. When I began to think of recognition of prior learning, I thought maybe I would do something different. Maybe I'm not going to mention epistemology.
Are you sure?
No, I'm not, but there'll be a temptation. But you've cut the cloth on that. If I had my little... Here's what I'm going to do today. I want you to take a look at the diagram here. This is my attempt to put in a diagram where I think your work is. It's in the area of policy, it's in the area of procedures, of practices, and provision. And as I meet people, I'm quite excited by the progress that has been made in the field of the recognition of prior learning. It's absolutely stunning. Let me put it this way. I think Susan, Nan, you talked about mobility. Andrina, you talked about mobility. Mobility is in the genetic makeup of adult education. The first 4 PhDs in adult education in Ireland all got their doctorates abroad. Like, we don't have to talk about, we are the most mobile nation in the world. We can't think without moving somewhere else. And that's why you find us all over the world. So on the right are those 3 areas that I think you are experts in and that you work in. And they're also the 3 areas in which I am least knowledgeable and least practiced and least aware of. So I'm going to have to rely on you to fill in those blanks. But I added 3, and this is where epistemology comes back. I'm going to add 3 areas on the left: pedagogy, philosophy, and psychology. So now I have an amazing thing called a 6P model of RPL. There it is, that's how it happens. And I'm not making any claim to say that this is how it is. All I'm saying is this is a useful heuristic device this morning. And I just plan to do one thing in our conversation. I want to take the concept of recognition and unpack it in such a way that it acquires deeper psychological, philosophical, and pedagogical depth and more significant meaning in this modern world, a world of crisis, a world of radicalizations, and indeed wars. Psychology is about that inner life. Philosophy is about thinking critically about what we are doing. And pedagogy, I use that just to keep the P theme going. It's really about learning and education. I intend to come to the conclusion that recognition itself is transformative. It transforms individuals and it transforms society. And in order to start the story, we need a kind of a once upon a time moment. We need to start the story with, well, once upon a time when we were babies. Let's take it back to there. When we were infants, John Bowlby said that psychologists are aware that we form attachments with an important carer in our lives. In order to survive that early life experience, each one of us needs one person to take an interest, to provide food, shelter, affection, warmth, care, and a safe space for that vulnerable state. If this safe space is responsive to the needs of the infant, the baby has a good chance of becoming someone, having an identity. This attachment bond gives the infant security. It also gives the parents great satisfaction. And this is the basis on which the child develops the confidence to launch out and explore the world. Most crucially, in those intimate moments of fun and play and interaction and affection, the tiny brain is developed, wired and fired with internal working models or maps of how the interpersonal world of relationships is formed and how they function. This happens for most parent-child relationships spontaneously, intuitively, and unconsciously. These interactions that create the programmed brain are moments of recognition. They are our first experience of recognition. They are the first moments when somebody, usually a mother, father, close family, look at us and recognize us as unique individuals worthy of their dreams, of their affection, of their care. So recognition is not just a conventional form of greeting or of conversation or of etiquette. It is a vital human need. We need recognition. This is not a new idea. You'll find it in Hegel, you'll find it in George Herbert Mead, John Dewey, and before any process of individuation, before we become somebody, we are already interconnected, related to others. The individual, Brecht says, is always multiple. The self is always plural. If one were to wonder which comes first, the individual or the interpersonal, all the evidence is that we are basically interpersonal in our construction. This is how we grow and develop. Someone recognizes the needs, the rights, the potential, and the human nature of another, and these moments of recognition are the ignition point. This is the ignition, the starter motor, for a range of endorphins and connectivities amongst our brain cells. And it takes very little for us to agree that these moments are when the basic ingredients of interactions and democracy are laid down. Because those close relationships, when they function, are essentially democratic, interpersonal, connected to other people. And all we have to do is to have that experience well enough. That's the demand. We can experience much of this ourselves if we remember a child. If we're not parents, we'll be as aunts and uncles or grandparents or granduncles. And we know, watch what happens when you praise a child. Watch the way they grow in front of you. They stand up straight. They become someone, no matter how young they are. This is how we grow. And this struggle for recognition by the child is initiated by the child and is not just initiated by the adult. Children look for and seek recognition. And as a result of the process of evolution, what we are is genetically programmed for recognition. And that's worth thinking about. That's like epistemology. That's a big deal. We're genetically programmed for recognition. It's not just an important element of your work, of your procedures, of your policies, and your practices. It's a primary driver in evolution, a basic need, an ingredient of our basic identity. You also know that if a child is misrecognized or ignored or abused, the brain does not develop the interpersonal skills, the abilities, and the identity that are considered to be the right of every child. They will struggle. Abuse and all misrecognitions have long-term consequences. The second idea. Since about 1995, Axel Honneth proposed a new idea. Well, he was really reworking the work of Hegel. And we have been exploring the notion that recognition is not just for children. And this is where we make our big leap into something with which we're a lot more familiar. The struggle for recognition is lifelong. So how can we, in these areas of psychology and philosophy, explore what it means to say that recognition is a lifelong struggle. Axel Honneth explains that the struggle for recognition does not end in childhood or indeed in the family. In fact, there are 3 areas in which recognition is sought, needed, given, required, and sometimes, unfortunately, denied. These areas are, like I've said, the close interpersonal relationships of family, but they're also important areas to achieve recognition in the world of work and in the legal system. Let me take just one of those areas and move us away from the world of children and of family. The state, your state, our state, my state, recognizes us in various ways. Through its laws, it becomes a very important delivery mechanism for recognition. For example, through disability rights legislation, the state recognizes the rights of people with various disabilities to have the same rights as everybody else, and goes on to give reasonable accommodation in society and in work and before the courts. Today, the rights of immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers are being challenged, and they struggle for recognition. The rights of LGBTQ+ are being argued for and fought for and struggled for, and though progress is slow, there are successes. In many cases, rights are won, sometimes removed, especially when economic conditions become harsh. These forms of recognition are developmental. They're developmental for our society. That's how our society grows. We recognize each other in a multitude of particular ways. And you'll find your own examples from around the world, but let me not just mention one from Ireland in passing. In 2015, in a referendum in Ireland, the constitution was changed in order to recognize the marriage as legitimate between any 2 people, irrespective of gender. That's a way, a very clear way, in which the state, through its constitution, recognizes individuals and their choices in life. And the point I want to make about this is that political is personal. That when something happens politically, it affects people personally. And those 2 things are not just connected in some direct way. They're connected dialectically. One is connected to the other. If we recognize people interpersonally, ultimately the state begins to recognize people. That the movement towards recognition of the marriage equality legislation started in families. It started when parents had to recognize their children and the choices they were making as legitimate and okay, and it moved from there. Workers' rights are also fought over, yet we recognize equal pay, minimum wages, healthcare, sick leave, maternity rights, the right to strike and protest, and so on. These are all recognitions. Much has been done. Third idea. Is there any empirical evidence for what I'm saying? Yes. In a piece of research I did, I was talking to someone this morning, a student of Fergal Finnegan, who was my research partner, looking at the experience of mature students when they return to higher education. And in Ireland, as part of a European-wide project, we found that the only way of understanding what students were experiencing when they went back to university was they were in pursuit of recognition. And they looked to those higher educational institutions as places in which they could achieve recognition. So there's empirical evidence for this. And the fourth idea, this is my final idea, I want to pull some of the ideas I've been talking about across that diagram, from the philosophy and the pedagogy and the psychology across to the practice and the areas that you're more expert in than I am. Democracy, the good life, psychological development, identity, social justice, equality, all of them presuppose recognition. APL is a moment in institutional and social recognition across society. I'm not sure everybody's read the concept paper. I just got a sense this morning that practitioners are very busy. But it was my job to catch up, and that was the way I did it. It asks whether APL is democracy in action. Is it a form of democracy in action? The concept paper assumes it is. Recognition, it says, protects democracy. The conference is asked to consider how RPL in the areas of individual skills, inclusion, and mobility are democracy in action. I want to go further. As a result of what I've been saying up to now, recognition and democracy assume each other. It's not just that recognition is democracy in action. They assume each other. That's how closely they're connected. Recognition is a cornerstone of democracy. You cannot have a democracy without recognition. How can you have democratic conversations without recognizing other people? So recognition is not just something we do as recognition of prior learning and in education. It's a cornerstone of democracy, its foundation. Democracy is not just a new add-on ingredient or criteria for RPL. Democracy is a form of recognition. In moments of recognition, democracy is created, taught, learned, progressed, or not, if there are misrecognitions. Meitheal is an Irish word for a gathering of people who come together to work together. It's an interpersonal underpinning for working together. And recognition is the key ingredient in that idea of Meitheal. The third point I want to make. Interpersonal relationships are the foundation of all recognitions. We may find this strange if we work in a world of policy, of procedures, or of practices that are so often, as you know, instrumental, technical, abstract, and impersonal. The outcome of real recognitions is only achieved in the context of interpersonal relationships. And you heard that point being made in the introductory talks this morning. You're welcome from Thessaloniki. I love Thessaloniki. I've been working with people in Larissa, and I fly into Thessaloniki every time. So you're welcome. We have good contacts with our Greek colleagues on Learning City projects, so you're more than welcome. The kinds of policies and practices and procedures that support VPL are always already more than merely following the rules. So accreditation of prior learning is more than, always more than the following of rules. They involve mutuality, intersubjectivity, and the kind of recognition that Hannah has been talking about. This allows us to reframe RPL, the abstract and impersonal that are it allows us to reframe the recognition of prior learning as grounded in other areas in society, including the family, work, and the legal system. Recognition is not just a procedure, a policy, or a set of practices. It is an impersonal and meaningful relationship that is loaded with generosities and the developmental recognition of a person. We arrive in the world pre-programmed, as I said, for attachment. We arrive in the world pre-programmed genetically for recognition. Recognition is the precondition for our very survival, for the formation of our identity. For those who work in the intimate sphere of family education, for instance, or work or political sphere, recognition is foundational for democracy. That's one of the themes of your conference. Now, I want to introduce one new theme to add to the kind of themes like mobility and skills. I want to add the concept of freedom. Freedom is a close friend of recognition. In fact, in the literature that supports this biennale, a great deal is made of the link between democracy and RPL. You can make the same point about freedom. But let me change the word freedom to emancipation. There's a long tradition in education philosophy and pedagogy that education is a source of imagination or source of emancipation. You've only to read Paulo Freire and you can understand very clearly that education is the way to achieve emancipation. We have to learn our way to freedom. Can we include recognition as an emancipatory impetus? Yes. Recognition is emancipatory. It leads to freedom. Why? Because when powerful institutions recognize us, a whole world of developmental opportunities opens up for us, not just certificates, qualifications, jobs, skills, mobility, but maybe more importantly, the impetus for emancipation is progressed. Recognition frees us from misrecognitions. Emancipation is the creation of a social world in which all are given and all receive their due recognitions as individuals and as members of families, as workers and under the law. RPL is not just an acronym or an abbreviation. It may be the foundation for everything that is good. Recognition is an emancipatory project. It frees people. It's the glue of a free society because the political is personal. Let me just raise one or two problematic ideas and see if I can, out of my ignorance of what you do, challenge you as well. Even people who know nothing might challenge us. So, prior learning, the whole idea of something being prior sounds to me to be problematic. The theory of, you see, if you recognize an infant, you don't recognize them for prior anything. There's no condition. You recognize them for what they are. So if we begin there, we recognize that infant for their potential, for their future, for the dreams that they encapsulate, for the hopes they have for our family, for ourselves, and for our society. So why don't we recognize learning? Forget about it being prior. We might even recognize potential learning. Look at the potential of people to learn. And that's the kind of thing that we should be doing when we're doing philosophy. And then it's up to you, to accept or to reject that or integrate that. I would also change the idea of we're recognizing prior learning. I'd hate my prior learning to be recognized. What I want to be recognized is what I know. What on earth do you know? That's what I'd like to be recognized for. Sometimes when I'm introduced at talks like this, someone gives a big long spiel, they talk about where I am and what I've done. And it's like a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. And the name of the fairy tale is The Shadow. And Hans Christian Andersen tells the story of the shadow, where the shadow is like some kind of image of someone, a reflection of them, but it's not them. And what happens if the shadow is more interesting than the person? What happens if their learning portfolio is more interesting or more important? Why do we look at the shadow? Why don't, so, I'm making the same point that I've been making since I've come up here, and that is recognition is getting at the person, not just their thing, their portfolio, their learning. It looks at them, their potential, and what they bring as learning. Recognition of prior learning has been transformative for higher education. And what the RPL community is engaged in is no less than the transformation of higher education and the transformation of society itself. Or, in RPL, is part of a greater project in society that involves the development of autonomous and free individuals and the creation of a more deeply grounded democracy, not just in higher education, but in society. With the current emphasis on functional learning, competency, behavioural outcomes, and a neoliberal-inspired valorisation of the market as the ultimate supplier of all our needs, these ideas about recognition take seriously the contribution of intersubjectivity as important for teaching, for learning, and transformation. It's an antidote to the dominant models that come from our economy. As we try to move learning from being less economic, less functional, and less instrumental, and become more communicative, more social, and potentially transformative and emancipatory, we know this is achieved by our emphasis on the always presupposed imperative of recognition. Thank you.